Hi, my name is Rob Vincent, and I'm going to be discussing the Young Lords organization. I want to start off by saying that the 1960s mark a turning point in the cultural history of the United States. American culture, particularly American youth culture, began to see a shift from the conservative ideals of the 1950s towards a more liberated, socially conscious camp. However, this inclusion of progressive ideas did not fester haphazardly. Social movements such as the women's rights movement, the Black Panther Party, and the civil rights movement were among a number of social movements that played a paramount role in the cultural, socio-political changes which served to define the 1960s. However, an often forgotten yet very prolific group which is indispensable to the discourse surrounding the social movements of the 1960s is the Young Lords organization, sometimes referred to as the Young Lords Party. The Young Lords organization began as a Puerto Rican Chicago street gang in the 1950s. Their formation as a street gang is largely tied to the lack of economic opportunity Puerto Rican people faced at that time in Chicago. The job market very much discriminated against them. The group began to establish their advocacy towards the plight of the Puerto Rican people, particularly those who were migrants. The main impetus for the formation of the group was a nationalist agenda towards Puerto Rican independence and self-determination. Now, their transition to a social movement was largely figureheaded by a member of the then gang named Jose Cha-Cha Jimenez. While serving a 60-day jail sentence, Cha-Cha was introduced to the writings of Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party. These inspired him to lead a transition of the Young Lords into a functioning social movement. With a nationalist prerogative and Cha-Cha's newfound leadership, the Young Lords became known as the Young Lords Organization. Also, during this time, the organization began expanding, establishing more than 24 chapters across the United States, all of which settled in predominantly Puerto Rican and Latinx communities. The most influential out of these subsidiary chapters were the ones established in New York City. The New York chapters differed from the Chicago counterparts. Chicago Young Lords were akin to grassroots traditional rhetorical strategies, whereas the New York Young Lords membership consisted mostly of college-educated individuals and other established leftists. The New York branches placed a particular rhetorical emphasis on decolonization. They proposed that in order to achieve self-determination, Puerto Rican people must reject modern coloniality. In spite of their prolific expansion and prolific output, the Young Lords met their downfall come the 1970s. This is largely due to their inclination towards mobilization as opposed to organization. Another nameable contributing factor is police interference. Police went to such measures as implementing quote-unquote red squads, which were specialized units focused on suppression tactics such as infiltration and constant arrest. Both of these contributed to the end of the Young Lords. By the end of the 1970s, the group was virtually inactive. In order to rhetorically analyze the Young Lords organization, it's cardinal to first define and categorize the group. However, the Young Lords display elements of both a counterpublic and a social movement. The Chicago Young Lords were rooted in a sociological, communicative school of thought, thus rendering them more of a social movement, whereas the New York Young Lords aligned more with the counterpublic classification, as they were more rooted in political and social theory, as well as the literature that comes along with those two subjects. Furthermore, it serves great purpose to take stock of the group's various motivations and use them to surmise an overarching goal distinct to the movement as a whole. Despite a broad array of motives felt by the group, the Young Lords sought a revolution amongst Puerto Rican people in the United States as their main overarching goal. The movement is also transparent in its influence drawn from the Black Panther Party. They adopted elements of the Black Panther Party's rhetorical output, such as the use of berets, the Young Lords being purple and not black. But they implemented those as a form of visual communication and a form of identity within the group. They also borrowed the Black Panther Party's inclusion of a newspaper, theirs, of course, being called the Young Lords newspaper, as opposed to the Black Panther Party newspaper. They implemented this as a rhetorical artifact because the Young Lords felt that community involvement was only achieved through educating the community and increasing the literacy amongst the community. In conclusion, the Young Lords are remembered as a landmark social movement amongst Puerto Rican and Latinx people, as well as a watershed organization within the broader scope of American civil rights. Hope that informs you and provokes some interest in the Young Lords organization. Thank you, guys.